Welcome to the Old Capital Real Estate Investing Podcast with Michael Becker and Pohl Peebles. During this program, you will hear interviews with real-life successful investors who will share their stories and provide useful advice on how to acquire, finance, and operate apartment complexes. Now, here they are, Michael Becker and Pohl Peebles.
Welcome to the Old Capital Real Estate Investing Podcast. I'm your host, Pohl Peebles, National Underwriter for Old Capital. And Heidi Ho, it is Michael Becker himself, Mr. Michael Becker, the smartest guy in the room. How are you?
Hey, Paul, doing pretty good. How are things today in Fort Worth side of town?
Business is going gangbusters, I have to tell you. So I'm going to ask that question back to you. Is this business ever going to stop, Michael? I mean, we've talked about the golden age of multifamily. What are you seeing right now? I mean, besides being very difficult to actually find properties that make sense, what is your 2 cents?
Yeah, no, it's confusing, to be honest with you, Paul. I mean, there's just a lot of money chasing, not as many deals right now. Bidding pricing is like gapping up considerably. It's not like a slow climb. It's like big gaps up along the way. Cap rates are pretty low. The debt market's a little choppier right now than it was a few months ago. We're going into rate hike season, and there's a war going on over in Europe. So it's a little choppy, but demand is insatiable and operational performance is tremendous. And so I'm seeing pricing continue to escalate.
My thing is it time to get into the building of multifamily properties? That the guys over at SPI, that they've been buying large multifamily properties for a long period of time. They started off in the 70s and 80s. They moved up to the 90s and the 2000s. The market has been so hot these days that you guys have been buying fairly new properties. Is it time for you maybe to start thinking about getting into the multifamily construction business and start actually building some properties so you can have some inventory to buy down the road? Never
say never, but that's a whole nother set of headaches and problems with supply chain and lumber and labor and everything else is going up. So that's not on the cards in the near term, at least. All
right. Sounds good. Hey, listen, we have one of our friends that's joined us in the podcast. He's a guy that does large transactions, and he is in the middle of the hottest area in the country. Whether it is a multifamily or it's technology or places that you want to go visit, or if you're from California, you want to go live in. He is down in our friend in Austin, Texas. So I'm going to bring on Matt Pohl. Matt, welcome to the podcast. And Michael, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Yeah. Appreciate you coming on. Matt's with Walker Dunlop. So maybe, Matt, you could just start by giving a kind of a brief background on yourself and, what do you do? And we'll start there.
You bet. Thank you both for having me on, and very exciting. First time to do this. So very much appreciate the opportunity. Austin is, in fact, on fire for a number of different reasons. We cover all of Central Texas. This is my 13th year of being an investment sales broker for multi-housing. We have a great team here at Walker and Dunlop, myself and Forrest Bass, Spencer Roy, Ali Anderson, Will Drumright, Kevin Dufour, Kyle Pico, and Patrick Short and Tom Toland on the capital markets side. We cover everything in Central Texas. Started in 2009 with a group. Anthony Tarantino out of Houston hired me. And about 2 years later, went to work at ARA before the Newmark trade, or I should say buy. And then I was at HFF for 6 years. And then 6 months after the JLL merger, moved to Walker and Dunlop, and Forrest Bass and I started this office in January of 2020.
Yeah, nice. So January 2020 has been a run, huh?
90 days into our having started the office, we were working from home and not real sure what the heck was going on out there, but it has come back like crazy, and we're kind of drinking through a fire hose right now.
Yeah, great. So maybe talk to you got a pretty good perspective. You cover two Central Texas, which really is just the two markets, right? You got San Antonio, you got Austin. They're very close in proximity, but very different in the way they kind of function. And so maybe kind of start there. Kind of what's the time you left from HFF to kind of where you are now? How's the market kind of evolved the last 2 or 3 years? And maybe kind of go through that on both Austin and San Antonio and kind of finish where what's kind of the view of the world right now at the end.
Sure, absolutely. The entire state, but specifically Central Texas, has been pretty much a rocket ship. There's a ton of activity going on out there right now. What I would say of our team is we sell everything. When you think about profile of opportunity or profile of property. We sell the late 60s flat roof, kind of the value add deal that doesn't garner a ton of attention. And we sell the brand new product, luxury, if you will, merchant space. So we've taken deals out that are just beginning their lease up and sell some of the junk too. But over the last 2 years, it has been pretty phenomenal. The market basically just went stagnant in March of 2020. But what became abundantly clear is that about 6 weeks after being incredibly stale, we saw buyer demand come back into the fold, and we started seeing sellers rear their heads up with interest in a potential disposition. Most of those sellers in profile were groups that had owned from 4, 5, maybe longer. And for whatever reason, maybe it was a capital need that was beginning to show itself, and they didn't really want to come out of pocket to tackle some of those larger CapEx items. But the point there being that we started taking deals to market in Memorial Day of 2020. And it was pretty shortly thereafter that we saw a pretty active buyer pool that was very interesting to see play out. Keep in mind, we couldn't tour. Due diligence was incredibly difficult. First time in my career, we had DD periods that were well over 60 days and that was just a function of you couldn't get into units. I mean, it was the COVID fear existed in a significant way. And so it became very challenging to do deals. Slowly but surely, the lenders came around to being comfortable with a pretty small subset of units needing to be walked for them to get comfortable with placing acquisition financing on the opportunity. And that really began to spur the market back into action. 2020 was a year that was dominated by agency executions. And so I would say 85%, if not more, of deals that were sold were financed by Fannie or Freddie. When you compare that to what took shape in 2021, keep in mind that we got hammered by this winter storm that was a 100-year storm in Texas. There were a lot of units that were taken offline, and that was in February of 21. And the market was wasn't trading nearly at the pace, and there was still a lot of firm footing to be found. People weren't entirely certain of what lied ahead. Coming out of the first quarter, and I would say at the beginning of what we call the historically popular leasing season, which is really April to September, if not October, the demand and the leasing velocity was very much in its infancy, but was taking flight in a way that none of us had ever seen. And so when you look at the beginning of the third quarter, properties were effectively full. You started seeing cap rate compression play out in a very significant capacity. And that was a function of seeing what renewals, seeing what trade outs, seeing what new leases were able to achieve. And you had a buyer pool that was leaning into those numbers. And so pretty quickly within that summer period of time, we were paying close eye to what each floor plan was achieving on recent leases, because it was a barometer for what we believed the value to be benchmarked off of. We saw cap rates routinely going sub 4. And I say that because that's really an important metric to point to right now, because a 4 cap is nowhere to be found in the state of Texas. And I would make the argument that it's pretty darn tough to find anywhere in the Sun Belt. You had value creation very quickly. The market has just been a slingshot higher since really the beginning of the second quarter last year. With all of that activity, you saw a ton of product brought to market in Labor Day. And it was a very active launch period, if you will. I think all of us can remember, how tired we were at some level. It was buyer fatigue and just overall exhaustion from a very, very active marketplace over the summer, led to sellers launching a whole heck of a lot of product at the Labor Day timeframe. So allocations were largely full. Pricing was holding, but your bid lists were a little lighter. Buyers had the opportunity to pick and choose. They had the ability to prioritize. So while they would come tour your property, they were touring probably 4 or 5 others, and they got to pick which one that they felt more passionate about. So you had a lighter bid list, the best and final process, albeit strong. You didn't see as many sealed bids. Then sealed bid was a term and a practice that we used pretty routinely last summer. And that was just a function of we didn't really know where pricing ultimately would land. There's a ton of back-end channeling from buyers these days. trying to kind of get last look, and it's incredibly challenging you got to keep a fair process, in motion. Latter part of the third quarter, not so much. I mean, the sealed bid wasn't necessary, truth be told, because in many respects, your best and final process wasn't warranting that 5 to 7% price increase, whereas 90 days prior it was. When you look at 2022, it's fascinating, in my opinion, to see what has played out over that, call it 6 to 9 month period of time. A lot of product was pushed up. Developers these days can basically take their property to market at about 20 to 25% leased, and in some cases less than that, and effectively get full value. Truth be told, I'm of the opinion that you've seen so much face rate growth through these properties lease up that buyers are getting a pretty good deal. Pricing is moving so fast that by the time you contract 30 days later, there's no doubt some level of price appreciation has taken shape.
Talk to me. I want you to continue your story. Where is pricing today in a Class A building, just normal Class A building coming out of lease up? Where are you seeing it versus what it was last year?
I would say those year one projections for an Austin is going to be between a 3.25 and a 3.5 cap on a year one stabilized number. The biggest question is, what rents are they projecting to solve for that year one stabilized figure? More often than not, they're going to take your most recent leases and apply that as the new weighted average rent for their year one of operation. I think there's a high likelihood, just given what I think is likely to play out in 22, that you're going to just continue to see a lot of rent growth. The demand is so significant that it's hard for anyone to really get a good feel for where their ceiling is.
Like, when did California become moved to Austin?
I know, right? And so you're saying it's between 3.25, 3 and 3.25 in Austin. What does that look like? Year one, pro forma, buyer pro forma. So like you buy it at 20% occupied, you get it full, you mark to market the rents like today, that's 3.25 tax adjusted. What does that look like in San Antonio?
You're probably 3.5 in San Antonio. You're about a 25 to 50 basis point swing. So if you're a 3.25 to 3.5 in Austin, depending on location, you're probably a 3.5 to 3.75 in San Antonio.
What is that like a workforce? So if we're buying a 70s vintage deal versus a new construction deal, what does that look like from a cap rate standpoint?
Truth be told, I think anything 80s and newer is probably going to be pretty darn close to that.
Yeah.
70s, you're going to have a limited buyer pool. It's going to be slightly different. You may find a deal that's closer to a 4 cap, but there's not much. I mean, it's all, when I quote these numbers, I'm talking about a tax adjusted figure. And I think that is important to note. But those tax adjusted figures on even a 70s, you'll be pushing close to a 4. If it's a late 60s flat roof deal that maybe master metered, that's probably a 4.
Yeah.
But keep in mind too, it's somewhat challenging to peg these actual year ones, stabilized quote unquote cap rates, because rents are moving so fast. No one really has a good feel for where their ceiling in rents is. And that's just a function of demand. Leasing velocity is far superior to anything we saw leading up to 2020. 2021 made 2019 look like an average year. And 2019 was a gangbusters year in the way of trade volume. Yeah. But you're 50% over 2019 when you look at the 2021 figures. So
that's these deals. So like on a historical, like a trailing basis, tax adjusted, I mean, you're talking like high ones to low to mid 2s on a trailing tax adjusted cap basis.
I would say the historical methodology of solving for value, which is in 2018 for context, would be taking T3, annualizing that revenue figure and tax adjusting your operation to a purchase price, typically 90 to 95%. But comparing it to a T12 expense load and solving to a cap rate. That is just simply not the way the market trades right now. You're looking at recent leases, you're looking at a subset of leases within specific floor plans, and you're getting pretty granular on what properties are able to achieve. But by way of that growth in organic growth being, in San Antonio's case, 17%, in Austin's case, 25%, those cap rates, we didn't sell a single Austin. I take that back. I would say average cap rate last year for Austin was probably a 2.7 and change. San Antonio was probably a little over, call it 3.7. So pretty wide. It has definitely not gotten to the Austin level But now San Antonio's on fire. So those numbers are compressing like crazy right now.
Yep.
Hey, Mike, I'm just a dumb limited partner investor, and I'm trying to see how this stuff works. You got cap rates at X, you got debt at Y. What's the story with that?
You're starting to get negatively geared, right? Your debt, your interest rates are going to be above your cap rate. So it's making this stuff really hard to make any damn sense of a lot of things out there. It really is.
Well, here's the thing that I find to be fascinating. Austin brought on 11,000 units last year and absorbed about 20. So, these cap rates feel really, really low. There's no doubt about it. However, these rents are escalating at a pace that, we talk about these year one stabilized numbers. Well, they could very easily exceed any projection that you have your first day of ownership. So it's very, very likely, in my opinion, that you're going to have a 2022 year that looks a lot like 21 in the way of rent growth. San Antonio, for context, they absorbed almost a 3-to-1 ratio of units being brought online. So they brought on about 4,500 units and they absorbed over 11,000 units. So these cap rates feel tight, but the housing market in Central Texas is severely undersupplied for the in-migration that we're experiencing. And I think the same can be said for a lot of markets, not only within Texas, but elsewhere. There's just a legitimate shortage of housing. And if you factor in the single family price appreciation that's materialized over the last 18 months, it has led to a renter pool that I think is as deep as we've ever seen.
Yep.
And so it feels expensive. And Paul, to your point on construction, do you start developing? I can tell you the construction costs are rising just as quickly as value. And land appreciation is just simply through the roof. So we need the product. It's tough as nails to buy a home in Austin, Texas. We have a housing shortage. We have to figure out a way to solve for it. And truth be told, if you're an owner of these apartment complexes, I think there's a tremendous amount of value in that capacity.
So you were talking with Paul, kind of going the history lesson the last 2 years, and Paul jumped in. You're about to get to January of 2021 and how there was basically little to no inventory on the market. And I know Matt sold a property for one of our advisory clients, or in the process of selling it now. We got just a tremendous amount of offers. It was very, very limited. It was probably like the only Class A suburban deal on the market at the time. Yeah. For a matter of a few weeks, and in a market that has got 250,000 multifamily units in it or something like that. Are you starting to see that loosen up a little bit? Are we starting to see some more inventory come? Because as you said, all these deals that should have been out in the first quarter got kind of pulled forward into 2021 for various reasons, as you kind of described.
Right. The beginning of every calendar year is typically a pretty popular one in which to launch your deal to market, whether that be tying it to the NMHC conference, which is more of a networking conference than a deal-making conference these days, but it is a popular time to go out to market with your deal. We are were insanely light on available product. And I think to your point, Mike, a lot of that got pushed up to the middle part of the third quarter. And so what I see playing out right now is one of the most noticeable supply-demand imbalances that I've seen in a considerable amount of time when you compare the number of buyers to the number of deals available for sale. And so what that has created is a set of circumstances with both our team, but I would venture to say most brokerage houses are exceeding their BOV values in considerable fashion. And I can assure you, at least myself and team, we're not conservative on what we believe we can achieve when it comes to our BOV values. So the fact that we're we're off the page to the high end on more deals than not. And I believe that to be a tremendous allocation of dollars towards the housing industry, period, with very little to pursue. And these groups have to get it out. Liquidity is profoundly deep in the space.
Hey, Mike, you talked about this transaction that Matt and you worked on. You said there was a lot of potential buyers in the deal and a lot of offers that came in. I hear a few. Is that 5, 10, 6, 12? I mean,
trying to remember what the bid sheet was. We probably had 35 bids, Matt, and we probably had 8 or so, Paul, grouped at the very top, pretty on top of each other, and then really three that were like really up there. And we saw, what I'm seeing, and Matt, I'd love to get your feedback. So Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, what I'm seeing, these marketed deals here, the first quarter of 2022 or 10 weeks or so into the year as we record this, I'm seeing from the time you submit where the top of the pack is on the initial round to the time you finish the best of final, it seems like a minimum of 5% movement in that week in between initial to final. In a lot of cases, 7, 8, 9% movement on some of the deals I've been kind of following and tracking. Is that kind of jive with what you're seeing?
Yeah, I would say that truth of the matter is when you announce that CFO and you're about a week out from that initial bid being due, that's when it starts to really heat up. When we provide guidance these days, we have to say initial guidance. That's a 2022 tag on, if you will. And that's just a function of you have a sense of where you believe it will shake out. You've been providing guidance throughout the entirety of the process as a way to just assist those that are looking at your deal. But pretty routinely right now, we're back to sealed bids, which is an indication that, it's so competitive that, they effectively have to send it directly to the owner so that it's a completely fair process. And that's a normal exercise right now. I will say within the last 2 weeks, I think our BOV volume is quite a bit higher than what the first 2 months of the year provided. So I think you are very likely to see a wave of product come out, call it late March, early April. And I think for the earlier you can get your hands on deals, the better the deal that you're going to get. These values are going to continue to rise.
Talk about, you said sealed bids. I mean, that's not really a phrase I'm not too familiar with, because I've always seen it as an open market where you are selling a deal and you've probably brought it to market yourself. And then, 5 people in your office are also representing people that want to buy that deal. You bring in a bid of X amount of dollars and your colleague sees it, calls his guy and says, hey, listen, bring it up another $3,000 a door. It could be you. Then it goes back and forth. Is this the sealed bid? Is that trying to stop that type of stuff?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, the sealed bid is the last lever you pull. You've whittled the field down considerably. You typically don't take a sealed bid process through to 8 different groups. It would be a much smaller subset of finalists, if you will. And the goal there is, first off, we're pretty sensitive to buyer fatigue. So we don't want to just work these groups over until they're numb by way of just this constant 4 or 5 rounds of bidding and just not ever finding a buyer. So once we conduct interviews, it's not uncommon for us to ask that finalist, that group of finalists, to just basically submit their bid directly to the owner, and the owner gets back to us and says, here's what we're going with. But it's the very last stage of a very hotly contested deal. It doesn't happen every deal, but it is most certainly a practice that can be instituted in which to help that. Yeah,
Mike, going back to that transaction that you guys were doing some of that SPI advisory work on, is it a mom and pop that buys something like that? Or is it an institution that buys something like that? When you start to get to some of these big dollars, I mean, who's buying properties these days in Austin where the properties are so damn expensive?
Right. Deep and diverse, right, Matt? I mean, there's a little bit of everybody. Paul, I mean, you got your private guys. I mean, this was pushing $80 million. So you're not getting too many people. But I mean, hell, over half the guys I never even heard of. Is that what you're seeing, Matt? I mean, all the people like me that have been there for a while still want to be there and increase their position. You have some regional players kind of that are trying to expand into Texas and Central Texas specifically. And then you're just getting these random people from the coast and wherever no one's ever heard of that have $100 million in 1031 money or a fund, discretionary fund they raise, and they just got to go place it. Maybe talk to the buyer pool, Matt.
Sure. All food groups are represented in Austin and San Antonio now. Austin's always been a hotbed of West Coast activity. As long as I've been in this business, I find myself calling LA, San Francisco, and just generally the state of California for existing owners. That is most certainly still the case, but I see a ton of activity in San Antonio right now, for context, coming from New York in the Northeast. And it's private, it's institutional, pension funds, you name it. I mean, it's pretty much everyone. They're looking for growth. The growth is here. It's in the way of job creation, it's population and migration. We're hitting on all cylinders at the current time. I think it's going to continue. But keep in mind, too, private capital, a lot of the groups that SPI is a great example. My guess is that if you've got a deal that you're going to put your name on and ask your investors to come in with you on it, raising $20 million can happen in 48 hours. I mean, it's very quick. I mean, groups are looking for opportunities in this space. And the best way to do it is to get in with groups that are actively on the pulse of the market. And there aren't that many of them. And thus the ability for the private capital to participate and compete with institutional capital. And by the way, more often than not, private capital is going to beat institutional capital on terms.
Let's go back in the flip side of that, the sellers. I mean, Michael and his advisory group kind of represented a seller on that. But Matt, what's your take? I mean, we always can think that the institutions want to sell when they hit their threshold based on their pro forma for 2-3 years ago. They're there right now. But why are some of these groups selling? I mean, you have the hardest job. It's easy to find the buyers. The tough job is really to find the sellers.
Oh, no doubt.
So what's giving people reasons why to sell these days?
Well, I would say more often than not, they see they can ring the bell and they want to do it. So there's obviously a profit take that's the leading cause for that. I will tell you that increasingly so, we see AUM being a focal point of many. 5 to 7 years ago, you had people just flat out selling multifamily and going into triple net retail because they were tired of the management headache. These days, they don't want to eliminate their presence within the housing space, period. So, they want to expand it. And that too has created a big contributing factor to the depth of the playing field now. But at the end of the day, there's no doubt about it. Finding the deal is far more challenging than finding the buyer. You love it when a buyer executes in the form and the fashion that they laid out prior to contract. But the reality of it is that there's not a whole lot of leverage for buyers to retrade, get queued on a PSA, things of that nature. I mean, the leverage is as a seller right now, you can kind of dictate what needs to happen. And more often than not, people step up and do it. And if they don't, there's someone right behind them.
So we've been scaring the hell out of everyone, probably trying to buy in the marketplace, telling you how tough it is. If you're looking to kind of crack into the market, or expand in the market, what the hell can they do to position themselves and to be in a better likelihood to win the bid, or hopefully get something that isn't going to be fully bidded and marketed? Are you seeing any off-market transactions happen? How do we kind of get on the right side of this business here?
And how many steak dinners and lobster dinners can they bring you to, and flying you on the private jet and golfing and all kinds of stuff? How can you be bought, Matt?
For what it's worth, and just to make it clear, I am firmly in the camp that you buy in 2022 and you're going to be really, really glad you did in 24 and 25. I do not see, even with a lot of chatter about interest rate volatility, I firmly and wholeheartedly believe demand metrics that are playing out in the housing industry, and it's at a very high level, is a great investment opportunity. And I don't say that just from the standpoint of being a broker, but how many times over the last 10 years have we talked about what we believe to be the crazy buyer that was leaning in a big way on value, only 2-3 years later be selling at a incredibly solid exit? And that's just a function of you've got high growth markets, you've got a lot of post-COVID world activity, and I think the housing space is going to benefit from it. Not to mention the tax advantages that come alongside it. It's a great time to buy. You buy in the second quarter of 2022, you're going to be glad you did it in the second quarter of 2023, if not the third quarter of 22. The market's hot. There's a reason for it. There's a reason why people all want to be pursuing these opportunities. And at the end of the day, I think it continues. But to answer your question, how do you get in? Just do what you say you're going to do. Prepare yourself to go non-refundable at PSA. Get your capital lined up, find debt relationships that you're confident in their ability to execute. And truth be told, pay more than you're comfortable with. Because I think, that's the reality of the world that we live in. And I think if we have anywhere close to the rent growth that we had last year, you're going to be so thankful that you've participated in the market, because I don't think we've reached our ceiling on rents or even close to it.
Yeah, you're right. I haven't been comfortable Well, actually, take it back. When you were talking about the fourth quarter, there was a couple deals we bought I felt really comfortable with. But everything we're looking at this year, just got awarded a deal the other day. It's going to finish an exchange off. And I'm definitely not comfortable. I'm slightly uncomfortable in that transaction, but I was real uncomfortable in a whole bunch of others. So I guess that's a win, being only slightly uncomfortable on the value. Paul, you got anything kind of add? I mean, it's unbelievable kind of seeing the growth. I mean, I guess maybe Matt, well, before Paul jumps in, maybe one last question for me is, right now, what is, like, looking at Austin, looking at San Antonio, if you had to buy one generic part of the market, segment of the market, is it San Antonio suburban, and is it workforce housing Class A? Is it Austin core? Where do you see maybe kind of some value right now looking through all that? What's not getting, the hyper attention like most of the market is, if anything?
There's not many that aren't getting significant interest. I think that if I'm buying, I love North Austin, suburban North Austin. I personally am not convinced that we have a completely normalized pre-COVID work from the office environment. So a focus on school district, a focus on single family price appreciation, and then ultimately proximity to job growth is significant. I think Round Rock, Leander, Cedar Park, North Austin has so much going for it. It's hard to really peg what it looks like in 5 years from now. There's a lot of job growth, and those single family pricing points, when you factor in taxes, are very, very expensive. In San Antonio, I love North Central and I love Northwest. I think that suburban San Antonio has a fantastic transportation infrastructure. You can get just about anywhere in town within about 25 minutes. Not the same with Austin, but I'm pretty bullish on Stone Oak. The Rim, the whole I-10 corridor is super solid. I think Westover Hills, call it the arms of a clock, 9 to 3, 9 to 2. Live Oak, Cibolo, New Braunfels is a fantastic market. Austin, the job growth east side of town is profound. So I think San Marcos, all of them have their attributes. Where I think rents get really, really high is the urban core of Austin. We're routinely over $4 a foot. I think you'll continue to see growth there. But personally, I think a cheaper price point on first and second ring suburban is going to have more demand, in my personal opinion.
So you got to know Matt Pohl over with our friends over at Walker Dunlop down in the Austin, San Antonio area. As you've heard from Matt, it is just a magical area, better known as the second or third West Coast of the United States. There's just no ocean there, but there is a lot of people from California that live in the Austin, San Antonio marketplace. So Matt, if someone wanted to get more information from you about how to work together, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Email, cell phone. I operate largely from cell phone. So, I mean, you can look at the Walker Dunlop website, get contact information off of our website. Feel free to call myself or anyone on our team. We all work very cohesively and as one team. So you talk to anyone on the team, you're going to get a pretty clear picture on what we're cranking on.
So Matt, we certainly do appreciate it. Again, if you want to build a better relationship with Matt, make sure that you send him a steak or a lobster, and you can just put it ahead of Matt Pohl in care of Paul Peebles at Old Capital. We'll make sure that he gets it somehow. But we certainly do appreciate Matt being on the podcast today. And don't forget, Old Capital is sponsoring the 3-on-3 basketball tournament for homelessness. So that's going to be at the end of the month in March. Again, 3-on-3 March Madness with the Old Capital. Go on to the Old Capital lending.com website and sign up for the 3-on-3 tournament. If you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we'd love to have you. It's always a great thing over at SMU. And we raise a ton of money doing that opportunity for homelessness. So Matt, thank you for being on the podcast. Michael Becker, smartest guy in the room. Thank you. I'm Paul Peebles. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Old Capital Real Estate Investing Podcast. Please join us at oldcapitalpodcast.com to sign up for our weekly email updates. We'll see you next week for another great interview.